I never thought I'd be standing on my own son's porch, feeling like a stranger. My hands trembled as I held that small suitcase. Everything I owned after losing my apartment fit into one bag. 55 years of life, reduced to a few clothes and memories. The rain had started falling, and I could hear voices inside. My son David's deep tone mixing with his wife Patricia's sharp words. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tension was unmistakable. For 28 years, I had been David's entire world. His father left when David was just 2, disappearing like smoke, leaving me to figure out how to be both mother and father to a confused little boy. I worked double shifts at the diner, my feet swelling in those cheap shoes, just so he could have new school clothes. I skipped meals so he could eat. I gave up dating, gave up friends, gave up everything that might have been mine, because being his mother was all that mattered. I remember the night he graduated high school. How proud I felt watching him walk across that stage. He was the first in our family to finish school, to have real opportunities. I had worked 3 jobs that final year, cleaning offices at night after the diner closed, just to make sure he could focus on his studies instead of worrying about money. When he hugged me that night, tears in his eyes, he whispered, "Mom, I'm going to take care of you someday. I promise." Those words had carried me through the hardest years. When my back started giving out from all those years of physical labor, when the arthritis made my fingers ache every morning, when I had to move to that tiny apartment because I couldn't afford anything better, I held on to that promise. I told myself it was temporary, that once David got established, once he found his way, we'd be a family again. But Patricia changed everything. From the moment she entered David's life 3 years ago, I felt the distance growing. She was educated, polished, everything I wasn't. She had opinions about everything. How I dressed, how I spoke, why I still lived in the old neighborhood. At first, David would defend me, but gradually, her whispers became louder than my presence. The visits became shorter, the phone calls less frequent, and the excuses more creative. Standing on that porch, I could feel the weight of every sacrifice I'd made, the dreams I'd buried, the chances I'd never taken, the love I'd never allowed myself to feel. All of it had been poured into raising this man who was now my only family. The rain was getting heavier, seeping through my thin jacket, but I couldn't bring myself to knock. Something inside me already knew what was coming. If you enjoy stories that touch the heart and show real human strength, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment below to let us know what city you're watching from. Through the window, I could see them in their beautiful living room. The furniture I could never afford. The artwork on walls I'd helped paint when they first moved in. The life I'd dreamed we might someday share. Patricia was gesturing with her hands, her perfectly manicured nails catching the light. David sat with his head in his hands, and for a moment, I thought maybe he was defending me. Maybe he was telling her that his mother needed help, that family meant something. But when he looked up, when his eyes met mine through that rain-streaked window, I saw something that broke my heart into pieces I didn't know could be broken. It wasn't love or concern, or even guilt. It was embarrassment. I was an embarrassment to him. His mother, who had given him everything, was now something to be hidden away, something that didn't fit into the life he'd built. That's when I understood the real tragedy of loving someone so completely that you lose yourself in the process. I had been so busy being his mother that I'd forgotten to remain a person. I'd become invisible in my own story, existing only in relation to him, having no identity beyond what I could give or do for others. And now, even that role was being taken away from me. The door opened before I could decide whether to knock or walk away. David stood there, tall and handsome in his expensive shirt, looking nothing like the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Behind him, Patricia hovered like a shadow, her arms crossed, her face set in that expression I'd learned to recognize. The look of someone who'd already made up her mind about something, and that something was me. "Mom," he said. And even that single word sounded different now. Not warm like it used to be, not the way he'd said it when he was proud of his good grades or excited about a baseball game. This was the voice of someone fulfilling an obligation, someone going through the motions of being a son while his heart was already somewhere else. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain about losing the apartment, about having nowhere else to go, about being his mother and needing help. But the words never came, because in that moment, looking at these two people who were supposed to be my family, I realized I was about to hear something that would change everything. The rain kept falling, washing away the last of my hope, and I stood there like a woman drowning on dry land, waiting for the words that would push me under completely. "We don't want you here anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow, each one landing with surgical precision in the exact spot where a mother's heart lives. David's voice was steady, rehearsed, as if he'd practiced this moment in front of a mirror. Behind him, Patricia nodded approvingly, her satisfaction barely concealed behind a mask of fake concern. I stood there in the rain, my suitcase growing heavier by the second, trying to process what I'd just heard. This was my son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep every night when nightmares plagued him, the teenager I'd sat up with during his first heartbreak, the young man I'd helped through college by working myself to exhaustion. And he was telling me I wasn't welcome in his home, in his life. "David, I just need a place to stay until—" I started, but Patricia stepped forward, her designer heels clicking against the marble threshold like a warning. "Isabel, we've talked about this," she said, using that voice she reserved for addressing children or people she considered beneath her. "We're starting our own family now. We need space, privacy. Surely you understand that a grown woman should be able to take care of herself by now. A grown woman should be able to take care of herself." The irony was suffocating. I had taken care of myself, and him, for decades. I had been the only parent, the only provider, the only one who showed up when it mattered. But now, apparently, all of that was ancient history, irrelevant to the new narrative they were writing for their lives. "I wouldn't be any trouble," I heard myself saying, hating how small my voice sounded. "I could help around the house with cooking, cleaning. I could pay rent once I find another job." "Mom, stop." David's words cut through my desperate bargaining like a knife. "This isn't about money or help. We need our space. Patricia is pregnant, and we need to think about our future now." Pregnant. The word hung in the air between us like a revelation and a death sentence all at once. My first grandchild was growing inside this woman who despised me, and I was being banished before I could even celebrate the news. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. To use new life as a reason to discard the old one, to use the promise of family as justification for destroying what family already existed. "Congratulations," I whispered, because what else could I say? Even in my devastation, even as my world crumbled around me, my instinct was still to put his happiness first. "I'm so happy for you both." Patricia's expression softened slightly, perhaps mistaking my genuine emotion for acceptance of their decision. "Thank you, Isabel. I'm sure you understand that we need to focus on our little family now. It's nothing personal. Nothing personal. As if 28 years of motherhood could be dismissed as impersonal. As if the scars on my hands from working in restaurant kitchens, the permanent curve in my spine from bending over tables for tips, the gray in my hair that came from years of worry and sacrifice, as if none of that was personal. As if I was just some stranger who'd wandered onto their porch asking for charity instead of the woman who'd given her entire life to make his possible. "Where will you go?" David asked. And for a moment, just a moment, I heard something that might have been concern in his voice. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw only the reflection of his own guilt, not genuine care for my well-being. "I'll figure something out," I said, because what was the alternative? Begging? Crying? Reminding him of every sacrifice I'd made, every dream I'd abandoned, every dollar I'd spent on his future instead of my own security? I still had some dignity left, even if everything else was gone. "Maybe you could contact some of your old friends," Patricia suggested with the tone of someone offering helpful advice rather than someone who'd just made me homeless. "Or there are programs for people in your situation, programs for people in my situation." She meant programs for the indigent, for people who'd failed to plan properly for their old age, for women who'd made bad choices and were now paying the price. She couldn't say homeless shelter directly. That would be too honest, too cruel even for her. But we all knew what she meant. I picked up my suitcase, my knees protesting as I straightened. The rain had soaked through my jacket completely now, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the pain radiating from the center of my chest, spreading outward like poison through my veins. "I understand," I said, though I didn't understand anything anymore. How does a mother understand being rejected by the child she raised? How does a woman understand becoming invisible to the person she loved most in the world? How does anyone understand having their entire identity erased with a few cold words on a doorstep? "Take care of yourself, Mom," David said as I turned to walk away. The automatic politeness of it, the casual dismissal wrapped in fake concern, was perhaps the cruelest part of all. He was already mentally closing the door, already moving on to his new life where I didn't exist. I walked down their pristine driveway, past the luxury cars and manicured landscaping that I'd helped make possible through years of sacrifice. My footsteps echoed on the wet pavement, each one taking me further from the only family I had left, further into a darkness I'd never imagined possible. Behind me, I heard the door close with a soft, final click. No dramatic slam, no raised voices, just the quiet, civilized sound of a family sealing itself off from the inconvenience of an aging mother who no longer served their purposes. The porch light went off a moment later, leaving me in complete darkness, except for the streetlights that illuminated my path to nowhere. As I walked away from my son's house, from my son's life, I felt something inside me shift. The desperate, pleading mother who'd stood on that porch was dying with each step, and I didn't know yet what would rise to take her place. All I knew was that the woman who'd given everything had finally been given something in return. The truth about how little any of it had mattered to the person who mattered most to her. The shelter smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. I sat on the narrow cot they'd assigned me, staring at the peeling paint on the wall while women around me whispered their own stories of abandonment and betrayal. Some were younger, victims of domestic violence or addiction. Others were closer to my age, casualties of divorce or economic hardship. But I felt uniquely foolish among them, the only one who'd been discarded by the very person she'd sacrificed everything to raise. "First night?" asked the woman in the cot next to mine. Her name was Rose, and she had kind eyes that had seen too much. "It gets easier. Not better, but easier." I nodded, not trusting my voice. During the intake process, I'd had to explain my situation to a social worker who couldn't have been older than David. She'd looked at me with a mixture of pity and confusion, clearly wondering how a woman my age had ended up with no family support, no savings, no backup plan. How do you explain that you put all your eggs in one basket, and that basket was your child's love? The days blurred together in a haze of job applications and rejection letters. Overqualified, they said about positions I desperately needed. Underqualified, they said about anything that paid enough to matter. My age worked against me in ways that were never stated outright, but were brutally obvious. Employers saw gray hair and saw expense, liability, someone who might need sick days or health insurance they didn't want to provide. I started taking buses across town just to walk through neighborhoods where David and I used to live, past the elementary school where I'd volunteered every Friday for 6 years, past the park where I'd pushed him on swings until my arms ached. I told myself I was job hunting, but really I was trying to remember who I'd been before I became invisible. The worst part was how my mind kept replaying every interaction with Patricia, searching for signs I'd missed, moments I could have handled differently. Maybe if I'd been more supportive of their relationship from the beginning. Maybe if I'd made more effort to bond with her, to show interest in her career, her opinions, her plans. Maybe if I'd been more grateful, less needy. If I'd somehow made myself indispensable instead of inconvenient. But then I'd remember David's face in that doorway. Not conflicted, not anguished, but determined. This hadn't been Patricia's idea alone. My son, my baby, the boy I'd carried in my arms and in my heart for 28 years, had actively chosen to cast me out. The realization hit me fresh each time, like a wound that wouldn't heal because I kept picking at it, unable to believe the depth of his betrayal. 3 weeks into my stay at the shelter, I saw them at the grocery store. David was pushing a cart while Patricia examined organic vegetables with the concentrated attention of someone who'd never had to choose between food and rent. She was showing now, just barely, her hand resting protectively over her still small bump. They looked happy, content, like a perfect young couple preparing for their bright future. I should have turned away, should have fled to another aisle before they could see me. But something kept me frozen in place, watching this tableau of the life I'd been erased from. Patricia picked up a package of expensive prenatal vitamins, and David smiled as he placed them in the cart. The tenderness in that gesture, the care he showed for his unborn child, made my chest tighten with a familiar ache. "Isabel?" David's voice was uncertain when he finally noticed me. "What are you doing here?" The question was ridiculous. I was grocery shopping with the food stamps I'd qualified for, trying to stretch my limited resources to last through the week. But I could see what he really meant. What was I doing in their space, in their world? Reminding them of the mess they'd so neatly cleaned up by discarding me? "Hello, David." "Patricia." I kept my voice steady, professional, as if we were distant acquaintances rather than family. "How are you both feeling?" Patricia's hand moved instinctively to her belly, a gesture that staked her claim to the future I'd been excluded from. "We're doing very well, thank you. The baby's healthy, growing right on schedule." "That's wonderful." And I meant it, even as it killed me. Despite everything, the thought of my grandchild, a little person who would carry pieces of David, pieces of our family history, filled me with a love so fierce it took my breath away. "Have you thought about names yet?" David shifted uncomfortably, and I could see the internal battle playing out across his features. Part of him wanted to share this joy with me, the way children naturally want to include their mothers in important moments. But Patricia's presence beside him was a constant reminder of the choice he'd made, the loyalty he'd pledged to his new family at the expense of his old one. "We're considering a few options," he said vaguely. "Nothing decided yet." An awkward silence stretched between us, filled with everything we weren't saying. I wanted to ask if they'd thought about godparents, about nursery colors, about all the tiny details that expectant parents obsess over. I wanted to offer to help, to share stories about David's own babyhood, to claim my place in this new life they were creating. But I could see from Patricia's expression that any attempt at involvement would be unwelcome, another intrusion from the past they were trying to leave behind. "Well," I said finally, "I should let you get back to your shopping. Take care of yourselves." As I walked away, I heard Patricia's voice, pitched just loud enough for me to hear. "That was awkward. I hope she's not going to make a habit of approaching us like that." David's response was too quiet for me to catch, but his silence spoke volumes. He didn't defend me, didn't remind his wife that I was his mother and had every right to speak to them in public. He just let her dismissal stand. Another small betrayal in a series that seemed endless. That night, lying on my shelter cot, I couldn't stop thinking about that moment in the grocery store. The way Patricia had looked at me, not with hatred or anger, but with annoyance, as if I were a persistent salesperson or an overly friendly stranger who didn't understand social cues. To her, I wasn't a person with feelings and history and legitimate claims to connection. I was just an inconvenience, a reminder of the sacrifice and struggle that had made David's success possible, but that didn't fit the narrative of their self-made prosperity. For the first time since that night on the porch, I felt something other than grief or desperation. It was small, just a flicker, but it was there. Anger. Not the explosive, destructive kind, but something cooler, more focused. They wanted me to disappear, to fade away quietly so they could pretend their happiness hadn't been built on the foundation of my erasure. They wanted me to be grateful for my dismissal, to understand that my exclusion was for the greater good of their perfect family unit. But maybe I didn't have to disappear. Maybe the woman who'd spent her whole life making herself smaller, quieter, more convenient for others had finally learned something valuable in her rejection. Maybe it was time to stop apologizing for taking up space in a world that had never made room for her anyway. 2 months had passed since that grocery store encounter, and the anger I'd felt that night had crystallized into something harder, more permanent. I'd found work at a laundromat, minimum wage, no benefits, but it was something. The owner, Mrs. Chen, was a widow herself, who understood what it meant to rebuild from nothing. She didn't ask too many questions about my situation, just nodded when I explained I needed steady hours and a chance to prove myself. The work was simple, but exhausting. Sorting clothes, operating the industrial washers, folding endless loads of other people's lives. My hands were raw from the harsh detergents, and the steam made my hair curl in ways that reminded me of the humidity in that tiny apartment I'd lost. But there was something meditative about the rhythm of it all, the mechanical motions that kept my body busy while my mind wandered to darker places. It was there, surrounded by the constant churning of washers and the chemical smell of fabric softener, that I received the call that would break whatever remained of my spirit. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, a nurse from St. Mary's Hospital. "Ms. Rodriguez? This is about your emergency contact listing. We have David Morrison here asking about his mother, Isabel Rodriguez. He said you might know how to reach her?" My heart stopped. Something had happened to David. Despite everything, despite the rejection and the cruelty, my first instinct was pure maternal terror. "This is Isabel Rodriguez. I'm David's mother. Is he okay? What happened?" "Oh." The nurse's surprise was audible. "I'm sorry, there seems to be some confusion. Mr. Morrison is fine. He's here with his wife. She's in labor. He listed you as an emergency contact for insurance purposes, but when we tried to call the number on file, it was disconnected. He said he wasn't sure how to reach you." The words hit me like a physical blow. My grandchild was being born, and David had listed me as an emergency contact not because he wanted me there, but because he needed someone on the forms. A bureaucratic necessity, nothing more. And he wasn't sure how to reach me, as if I'd vanished from the earth instead of being systematically excluded from his life. Is the baby okay?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. "Everything's progressing normally," the nurse said kindly. "Would you like me to tell Mr. Morrison that we reached you?" "No," I said quickly. "No, please don't. We're not in contact anymore." After I hung up, I stood in that steamy laundromat, surrounded by the mechanical symphony of spinning cycles, and felt the last piece of my heart shatter. Somewhere across town, my grandchild was being born into a world where I didn't exist. There would be no phone call, no joyful announcement, no invitation to meet the newest member of our family. I would learn about this baby the way strangers do, if at all. Mrs. Chen found me crying over a load of towels an hour later. She didn't say anything, just handed me a tissue and patted my shoulder with the understanding that comes from having survived your own share of heartbreak. That evening, I walked the streets of our old neighborhood again, but this time it felt different. This wasn't nostalgia or hope. It was a funeral procession for the woman I'd been, the mother I'd thought I was. I stopped in front of David's childhood elementary school, where the playground equipment cast long shadows in the fading light. I remembered pushing him on those swings, catching him at the bottom of the slide, bandaging scraped knees and kissing away tears. He'd been such a sensitive child, always worried about fairness, about making sure everyone felt included. When other kids were mean to the class outcast, David would invite them to sit with us at lunch. When I had to work late, he'd leave little drawings on my pillow with messages like, "I love you, Mama," spelled out in his careful 7-year-old handwriting. What had happened to that boy? When had compassion been replaced by cold calculation? When had love become conditional on convenience? I found myself at the old church where we'd attended services when David was small, not because I was particularly religious, but because it was free childcare during their programs and the congregation was kind to struggling single mothers. Father Miguel was still there, grayer now but with the same gentle eyes that had seen me through some of my darkest moments when David was young. "Isabel," he said when he found me sitting in the empty sanctuary. "It's been a long time." I couldn't speak at first. How do you explain to someone who knew you as a devoted mother that your child has discarded you like garbage? How do you admit that everything you built your identity around has been revealed as meaningless? "I failed," I finally whispered. "I gave him everything, and it wasn't enough. He doesn't want me anymore." Father Miguel sat beside me in the pew where David and I had sat through countless services, where he'd fidgeted through sermons and fallen asleep against my shoulder during evening masses. "Tell me what happened," he said simply. And I did. All of it. The eviction, the rejection, the shelter, the job at the laundromat, the call about the baby being born into a world where I was officially erased. Father Miguel listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "Do you remember the parable of the prodigal son?" he asked when I finished. "That's different," I said bitterly. "David isn't lost. He chose to leave me behind. He's not squandering his inheritance. He's denying that I gave him one." "Perhaps," Father Miguel said quietly, "but the story isn't really about the son who left. It's about the father who waited. And more importantly, it's about the son who stayed home, but never really understood love at all." I stared at the crucifix hanging above the altar, remembering all the times I'd sat in this exact spot, praying for strength to get through another week, another month, another year of sacrifice. I'd thought God was testing my devotion as a mother. Now I wondered if maybe he'd been preparing me for something else entirely. "I don't know how to wait anymore," I admitted. "I don't know how to hope that someone will choose to love me when they've already proven they don't." "Then maybe," Father Miguel said gently, "it's time to stop waiting. Maybe it's time to choose yourself." That night, for the first time since the rejection, I didn't cry myself to sleep. Instead, I lay on my narrow shelter cot and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not the peace of acceptance or forgiveness, but the peace that comes from finally letting go of a rope you've been clinging to that was never actually attached to anything solid. The boy I'd raised, the son I'd devoted my life to, was gone. Maybe he'd never really existed the way I'd imagined him, or maybe Patricia had systematically erased the parts of him that might have remained loyal to me. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I had spent 55 years defining myself through other people's needs, other people's happiness, other people's success. For the first time in my adult life, I was completely alone, and terrifying as that was, it was also strangely liberating. There was no one left to disappoint, no one left to sacrifice for, no one left whose opinion of me mattered more than my own. But I still had something they'd forgotten about, something they couldn't take away no matter how thoroughly they tried to erase me from their story. I had myself, and maybe, just maybe, that was going to be enough. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with small things, barely noticeable shifts in how I moved through the world. I stopped checking my phone constantly, hoping for a call from David that would never come. I stopped taking the long way to work that led past his neighborhood, torturing myself with glimpses of the life I'd been exiled from. Most importantly, I stopped apologizing for existing. At the laundromat, I began to notice things I'd been too numb to see before. Mrs. Chen worked 16-hour days to keep her business afloat, but she always had a kind word for the elderly customers who came in confused about the machines. There was Maria, a young mother who brought her 3 children because she couldn't afford childcare, and somehow made the whole ordeal feel like an adventure for them. And there was Thomas, a veteran who'd lost his leg in Afghanistan and now lived in his van, but who always helped other customers carry their heavy loads without being asked. These people had stories, struggles, dignity that existed completely independent of whether someone else acknowledged it. They weren't waiting for permission to matter. They weren't defining their worth through someone else's acceptance or rejection. They were simply living, surviving, finding moments of grace in the most ordinary circumstances. I started paying attention to my own reflection in the laundromat windows. For months, I'd avoided mirrors, unable to face the defeat written across my features. But now I forced myself to look. Yes, there were lines around my eyes that hadn't been there before the rejection. Yes, my hair was grayer, my hands rougher from the work. But there was something else too. A steadiness in my gaze that surprised me. This woman looking back at me had survived 28 years of single motherhood. She'd worked multiple jobs, put herself through night school to become a certified nursing assistant, bought a house, raised a child who graduated college and found professional success. She'd done all of this without a partner, without family support, without anyone believing in her except herself. The woman in that reflection had accomplished things that deserved recognition, regardless of whether her son chose to acknowledge them. She had skills, experience, value that existed independent of her maternal identity. For the first time in months, I saw myself as more than just a discarded mother. I saw a survivor. One evening, as I was closing up the laundromat, Mrs. Chen approached me with an envelope. "Isabel, I've been thinking. My daughter lives in Sacramento now, and she's been asking me to move closer to help with my grandchildren. I've been putting it off because of the business, but..." She trailed off, and I could see the longing in her eyes. Unlike me, she had a daughter who wanted her presence, grandchildren who would benefit from her love and wisdom. The contrast should have been painful, but instead I felt genuinely happy for her. "You should go," I said firmly. "Family is important. That's what I've decided," she nodded. "But the thing is, I need someone reliable to manage things here while I'm gone. Someone who understands the business, who's good with customers, who I can trust. It wouldn't be ownership, but it would be management. Real responsibility, real authority, and a salary that reflects that." I stared at her, barely comprehending what she was offering. "Mrs. Chen, I don't have any management experience." "You have something better," she interrupted. "You have integrity. You show up every day. You treat people with respect. You solve problems without drama. That's not as common as you might think." She handed me the envelope. "This is what I'm prepared to offer if you're interested." Inside was a formal job offer that would triple my current salary and provide health benefits. More than that, it was recognition, someone seeing value in me that had nothing to do with being someone's mother or someone's anything. It was about who I was as a person, what I brought to the table in my own right. That night, I called Father Miguel and asked if we could meet. When I told him about the offer, his face lit up with genuine pride. "This is wonderful, Isabel. You see? When you stop trying to force doors that won't open, sometimes the right doors open by themselves." "I'm scared," I admitted. "What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough?" "You've been good enough to survive everything that's happened to you," he said gently. "You've been good enough to maintain your dignity when others tried to strip it away. You've been good enough to keep working, keep trying, keep going when giving up would have been easier. Why wouldn't you be good enough for this?" It was such a simple question, but it revealed how deeply I'd internalized David's rejection. If my own son didn't think I was worth keeping around, how could I trust that anyone else would value me? But sitting in that quiet church, I realized that David's opinion of me said more about him than it did about me. I accepted Mrs. Chen's offer. The shelter had rules about how long residents could stay, and my new salary meant I could afford my own place anyway. I found a small studio apartment above a bakery, nothing fancy but clean and safe and mine. The owner, an elderly Italian man named Mr. Rossetti, had lost his wife the year before and seemed to appreciate having someone reliable upstairs. As I signed the lease, using my own name, paying the deposit with money I'd earned through my own work, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Independence. Not the desperate, struggling kind I'd known as a young single mother, but the confident kind that comes from knowing you can take care of yourself because you've proven it. The apartment was tiny, but it had a window that caught the morning sun and a small kitchen where I could cook my own meals. I bought a secondhand table and chair, a few dishes, some books from the thrift store. Nothing expensive, nothing that screamed success, but everything chosen by me, for me, reflecting my tastes rather than someone else's approval. I started taking evening walks through different neighborhoods, not searching for my old life anymore, but exploring possibilities for my new one. I discovered a community college that offered business courses in the evenings, and I enrolled in a small business management class. At 55, I was one of the oldest students, but I wasn't embarrassed anymore about starting over. The other students, some just out of high school, others career changers like myself, welcomed me without judgment. In class discussions, my life experience turned out to be valuable. When we talked about employee relations, customer service, or crisis management, I had real examples to share. My professor, Dr. Martinez, often called on me because she said my perspective added depth to the theoretical concepts we were studying. For the first time in decades, I was learning something for myself, not to better serve someone else. I was investing in my own future, my own growth, my own potential. It felt revolutionary. On nights when loneliness crept in, when I wondered about my grandchild's first steps or first words, I would remind myself of something Father Miguel had said. Love that diminishes you isn't really love at all. Real love, the kind you deserve, should help you become more yourself, not less. I had spent so many years making myself smaller, quieter, more convenient for others that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to take up space unapologetically. But here in my tiny apartment, managing my own life, pursuing my own education, building my own future, I was finally learning. The woman David had rejected was disappearing, but not through defeat. She was evolving, growing, becoming someone stronger and more complete. Someone who didn't need anyone else's permission to exist, to matter, to thrive. And slowly, quietly, I was beginning to understand that their rejection hadn't been my ending. It had been my beginning. 6 months into managing the laundromat, I barely recognized the woman I'd become. The business was thriving under my care. I'd implemented new customer service policies, organized the space more efficiently, and somehow managed to increase revenue by 30%. Mrs. Chen called from Sacramento weekly, amazed at the reports I sent her, praising decisions I'd made that she never would have thought of herself. But more than the professional success, it was the quiet confidence that surprised me most. I walked differently now, spoke up when customers were rude to my employees, made decisions without second-guessing myself into paralysis. The woman who used to apologize for breathing had learned to take up space without shame. It was a Tuesday morning when Sarah walked in. I recognized her immediately, though she looked older, more tired than the young teacher who used to send such glowing reports home about David's academic progress. She was struggling with an industrial-sized load of what looked like classroom decorations. Her face flushed with frustration as she tried to manage the unfamiliar machines. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" Her voice was uncertain, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. "Isabel Rodriguez? You're David Morrison's mother, aren't you?" For a moment, the old shame tried to surface. Here was someone from my former life, discovering me in my new circumstances, ready to judge how far I'd fallen. But then I straightened my shoulders and smiled genuinely. "I am," I said simply. "And you're Sarah Martinez. Well, you were Sarah Martinez when you taught David's 3rd grade class. I'm sorry, I don't know your married name." "It's still Martinez," she laughed, and something in her expression relaxed. "I never married. Too busy with the kids, I guess." She gestured helplessly at the washing machines. "I'm completely lost here. The school's washer broke, and I have 30 sets of art smocks that need cleaning before tomorrow's parent presentation. Let me help," I said, moving to assist her with practiced efficiency. As we sorted the smocks and got the machines running, she watched me with growing amazement. "You really know what you're doing," she observed. "Do you work here?" "I manage the place," I said, and felt a surge of pride at the words. "The owner moved to be closer to her family, and I run the day-to-day operations." Sarah's eyes widened. "That's wonderful. You know, I always remembered you from parent conferences. You were so involved, so dedicated to David's education. I could tell he was going to succeed because he had such a strong foundation at home." The comment should have brought pain, reminding me of all that dedication had ultimately meant. Instead, I felt a strange kind of closure. "Thank you for saying that. Those were good years. How is David doing now?" she asked as we waited for the cycles to finish. "I heard he went into finance, got married recently." This was the moment I'd been dreading since she'd recognized me, having to explain my current relationship, or lack thereof, with my son. But looking at Sarah's kind face, I found myself speaking the truth without shame. "David is doing very well professionally," I said carefully. "He and his wife are expecting their first child. We're not in contact anymore. Different life directions." Sarah's expression shifted, and I could see her processing what I hadn't said directly. She was a teacher. She'd seen enough family dynamics to read between the lines. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That must be incredibly difficult." "It was," I acknowledged. "But I've learned that sometimes the most painful changes lead to the most necessary growth." When her laundry was finished, Sarah lingered as I helped her fold the tiny smocks. "Isabel, can I ask you something? The school where I teach now, it's in a low-income area. lots of single mothers struggling to make ends meet. We've been trying to start a life skills program, financial literacy, job training, that sort of thing. Would you ever consider being a guest speaker? Your story, what you've accomplished here, I think it could really inspire some of our parents." I stared at her speechless. Someone wanted to hear my story not as a cautionary tale or an object of pity, but as inspiration. Someone saw value in the journey I'd been forced to take, saw lessons worth sharing in the survival I'd had to learn. "I'm not sure what I'd have to offer," I said hesitantly. "Are you kidding?" Sarah's voice was passionate now, the same tone she'd probably used to encourage struggling students. "You're a single mother who raised a successful child, who survived homelessness and rebuilt her life, who's now running a successful business. You're exactly what these women need to see. Proof that setbacks aren't endings." That evening, I stood in my small apartment and tried to imagine myself speaking to a room full of parents, sharing the most painful and private experiences of my life as lessons rather than failures. The old Isabel would have been horrified at the thought of such exposure, such vulnerability. But this Isabel, the one who'd been forged in the fire of rejection and abandonment, felt something different. I felt ready. The next week, I found myself standing in front of 23 adults in an elementary school classroom, my hands trembling only slightly as I began to speak. I told them about working multiple jobs as a young mother, about the sacrifices and the small victories, about putting David through college. I told them about the eviction, the rejection, the shelter. But most importantly, I told them about the discovery that their worth wasn't determined by other people's recognition of it. I shared how learning to value themselves independent of others' approval could be the difference between surviving and thriving. A woman in the back row raised her hand. "But how do you forgive yourself for the time you lost believing you weren't enough? How do you stop being angry about all those years you gave away?" I thought about David, about all those years of sacrifice that had felt meaningful when I believed they were building toward a future that included me. I thought about the bitterness I could carry, the resentment that would be justified, but would ultimately poison only me. "I think," I said slowly, "that forgiveness isn't about pretending the hurt didn't happen. It's about refusing to let that hurt define your future." Those years weren't wasted if they taught me something valuable about my own strength. After the presentation, several women approached me with their own stories, their own struggles. A young mother whose ex-husband had left her with 3 children and no job skills. An older woman whose adult children had moved across the country and rarely called. A grandmother raising her daughter's children while the daughter battled addiction. Each story was different, but the underlying theme was the same. Women who'd given so much of themselves to others that they'd forgotten they had value independent of their usefulness. Women who, like me, needed to learn that their worth wasn't contingent on someone else's approval. Walking home that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. Purpose that had nothing to do with being someone's mother, someone's caretaker, someone's convenient solution. This was about being myself, sharing what I'd learned, helping others discover their own strength. I thought about David and Patricia, probably putting their baby to bed in the nursery I'd never see, reading bedtime stories I'd never share. For the first time, that image didn't bring only pain. It brought a strange kind of peace, as if I was finally separate enough from their story to wish them well without needing to be part of their happiness. They had made their choice, and I was making mine. The difference was that my choice was expanding my world rather than contracting it, connecting me to new people and possibilities rather than isolating me in the safety of the familiar. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I realized that somewhere in the process of rebuilding my life, I'd stopped waiting for them to realize what they'd lost. I'd started building something they could never take away from me, a sense of self that belonged entirely to me. It was a cold March evening, almost 18 months after that night on the porch, when I heard the desperate knocking on my apartment door. I was grading business plan assignments from my evening students. I'd started teaching a small entrepreneurship class at the community college, when the frantic pounding began. Through the peephole, I saw him. David stood in the hallway, his expensive coat wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled. His face was pale, almost gray, and there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen since he was a frightened child. desperation. For a moment, I didn't move. Part of me wanted to pretend I wasn't home, to let him experience what it felt like to stand outside a closed door, unwelcome and unwanted. But the mother in me, the part that apparently couldn't be killed by rejection or time, compelled me to open the door. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked on the word like he was 12 years old again. "Mom, I need help." I stood in the doorway, not inviting him in, studying the man who had once been my whole world. He looked older than his 28 years, worn down by something that had clearly been eating at him for some time. Behind him, I could see Patricia's expensive SUV idling in the parking lot, but she remained inside, probably unwilling to contaminate herself by entering my humble building. "What kind of help?" I asked, my voice steady and neutral. Can I come in, please?" I stepped aside and watched him enter my small space, his eyes taking in the modest furniture, the stack of student papers on my kitchen table, the business books on my shelves. He seemed surprised by the order of it all, the sense of purposeful living that filled every corner. "This is nice," he said awkwardly, and I could hear the confusion in his voice. He'd probably expected to find me broken, desperate, grateful for any crumb of attention he might throw my way. "Thank you," I replied simply. "What do you need, David?" He sat down heavily in my single armchair, the one I'd bought myself with my first management bonus. For a moment, he just stared at his hands, and I could see him struggling with how to begin. "Everything's falling apart," he finally whispered. "The company I work for is under federal investigation for fraud. They've frozen all our assets, and it looks like everyone's going to be charged as co-conspirators, even those of us who didn't know what was happening." I listened without commenting, watching my son unravel before me. I could go to prison, Mom. Real prison. And even if I don't, I'm unemployable now. No one in finance will touch me after this scandal breaks. The house is going into foreclosure. We can't make the payments without my salary. Patricia's parents won't help us because they say I should have been more careful about the company I worked for. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same in-laws who'd probably supported my exclusion from their perfect family were now refusing to help when that family faced real crisis. "What about Patricia's income?" I asked. "She's been on bed rest since the 7th month. Complications with the pregnancy. The baby came early, and she had to quit work to care for him full-time. Gabriel, that's his name, Gabriel. He's healthy now, but the medical bills..." David's voice trailed off. "Gabriel. My grandson's name was Gabriel. I'd had a grandchild for over 6 months, and I was just learning his name now, in the context of his father's desperation. "I'm sorry to hear about the complications," I said, and I meant it. Despite everything, I would never wish harm on an innocent baby or a woman in childbirth. David looked up at me then, and I could see tears in his eyes. "Mom, I know I have no right to ask this. I know what we did to you was wrong. But we have nowhere else to go. Patricia's parents cut us off, and my friends, they all disappeared when the investigation started. You're the only family I have left. The only family he had left. Now that everyone else had abandoned him, he remembered he had a mother. Now that his perfect life had crumbled, he was willing to acknowledge the woman he'd discarded when she became inconvenient. "What exactly are you asking me for?" I said quietly. "We need a place to stay," he said, the words rushing out like he was afraid I'd interrupt. "Just temporarily, until I can figure something out. I know your place is small, but maybe we could all squeeze in somehow. Or maybe you know of somewhere cheap we could rent. And if you could lend us some money for basics, food, baby formula, gas money, I swear I'll pay you back as soon as I get back on my feet." I stared at my son, this man who'd once meant everything to me, and felt an odd sense of completion. Here was the moment I'd probably fantasized about during my darkest nights in the shelter. David realizing he needed me, coming back desperate and apologetic, forced to acknowledge that I'd had value after all. But instead of the satisfaction I'd expected to feel, I felt something much more complex. Pity mixed with a clarity so sharp it took my breath away. "David," I said slowly, 18 months ago, I came to your door with nowhere to go. I was your mother who had sacrificed everything for you, who had never asked for anything except a place to sleep until I could figure out my next step, and you turned me away." He started to speak, but I held up my hand. Now you're in the same position, and you're asking me to save you. But here's what you don't seem to understand. I'm not the same woman who stood on your porch that night. That woman was broken, desperate, willing to beg for scraps of affection from people who'd made it clear she wasn't wanted. I stood up and walked to my window, looking out at the street where I'd built my new life, found my new purpose. The woman you're talking to now has learned something valuable, that love without respect isn't really love at all, and respect isn't something you can turn on and off depending on how useful someone is to you. David's face crumpled. Mom, please. I was wrong. We were wrong. I see that now. I'm sorry, truly sorry. Doesn't that count for something? Of course it counts for something, I said, turning back to face him. But apologies don't erase consequences. They don't undo the months I spent homeless because my own son decided I was disposable. They don't give me back the time I lost with my grandson because you decided I wasn't worthy of inclusion in his life. You could meet him now, David said desperately. Gabriel. He's beautiful, Mom. He looks just like I did as a baby. You could be part of his life, help us raise him. Isn't that what you always wanted? The manipulation was so obvious, so calculated, that it almost made me laugh. Even in his desperation, he was trying to use my love for family against me, trying to dangle the promise of access to my grandchild like a carrot to lead me back into servitude. What I wanted, I said quietly, was to be valued for more than my usefulness. What I wanted was to be treated with basic dignity and respect by the person I'd given my entire life to raise. What I wanted was for my love to be returned, not exploited. Through the window, I could see Patricia in the SUV, probably growing impatient. She'd sent David in to handle this unpleasant business while she waited in the car, still too proud to lower herself to ask the woman she'd helped discard for help. I can help you, I said finally, and I saw hope flare in David's eyes. But not in the way you're asking. I went to my desk and pulled out a business card, one of several I'd had printed when I started my consulting work with other small businesses. This is the contact information for Catholic Charities. They have emergency housing programs for families in crisis. There's also a food bank associated with St. Mary's Parish, and WIC can help with formula and baby food if you qualify. The social worker at the shelter downtown, her name is Rebecca Martinez. She specializes in helping people navigate bankruptcy and job placement programs. David stared at the card like it was a foreign object. You want me to go to charity? I want you to learn what I learned, I said. That sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover who you really are when all the pretense is stripped away. That accepting help from strangers can teach you humility in ways that taking family for granted never will. But you're my mother, he whispered, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he sounded like the boy I'd raised. Yes, I said softly, I am. And that's exactly why I can't enable you to continue believing that love means being rescued from the consequences of your choices without having to change anything about yourself. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything we'd never said to each other, all the ways we'd failed to truly see one another as complete human beings rather than just roles we were supposed to play. Finally, David stood up, the business card clutched in his hand like a lifeline he wasn't sure he wanted to grab. Will you at least think about it? David asked as he stood at my door, his voice carrying the same pleading tone he'd used as a child when asking for something he knew he probably didn't deserve. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and for the first time in 18 months, I felt something other than pain or anger when I saw his face. I felt compassion, but not the desperate, self-sacrificing kind that had defined my motherhood for so many years. This was different. The kind of compassion that comes from wisdom earned through suffering, the kind that offers truth instead of comfort. I have thought about it, I said gently. Every day for 18 months, I've thought about what I would say if this moment came. And what I've learned is that the greatest gift I can give you isn't rescue. It's the chance to discover your own strength. He nodded slowly, though I could see he didn't really understand yet. How could he? He'd never had to rebuild himself from nothing, never had to discover who he was when all the external markers of identity were stripped away. I love you, David, I continued, and I saw his eyes fill with tears. I will always love you. But love doesn't mean saying yes to every request or fixing every problem. Sometimes love means watching someone you care about struggle with consequences so they can learn to value what they have and appreciate the people who choose to stay in their lives. After he left, I sat in my quiet apartment and felt a peace I hadn't known was possible. There was no anger anymore, no bitterness, no desperate longing for things to return to the way they were. There was just acceptance of what had happened, of who I'd become, of the life I was building that belonged entirely to me. 3 months later, I received a letter. Not a phone call, not a text message, but an actual handwritten letter delivered to my apartment. The return address was unfamiliar, but the handwriting was David's. Neater than usual, more careful, as if he'd taken time to consider each word. "Dear Mom," it began, "I wanted you to know that we followed your advice. Patricia wasn't happy about it at first, but we went to Catholic Charities, and they helped us find transitional housing. The social worker you recommended, Rebecca, has been incredible. She helped me understand the legal process and connected me with a lawyer who specializes in cases like mine. It turns out I won't face criminal charges. The investigation showed that the junior staff really didn't know what the executives were doing. But you were right about needing to learn humility. Living in a studio apartment with a baby, shopping at food banks, accepting help from strangers. It's been the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's also taught me things I never understood before. I understand now what you went through when I was young, how hard you worked to give me opportunities you never had. I understand what it cost you to put me first all those years. And I understand how cruel we were to turn you away when you needed help the most. Patricia and I have been talking a lot about family, about what kind of parents we want to be, what kind of values we want to teach Gabriel. We both realize we have a lot to learn about love that isn't conditional, about loyalty that doesn't disappear when times get hard. I'm not writing to ask for anything. I'm writing to say thank you. Thank you for loving me enough to let me face the consequences of my choices. Thank you for showing me that real strength isn't about avoiding difficulty. It's about finding dignity in the middle of it. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness or to expect a place in your life after what we did. But if you're ever willing to meet Gabriel, I think he would benefit from knowing the woman who taught his father that being knocked down isn't the same as being defeated. I've learned that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about showing up, even when it's inconvenient. It's about choosing to love someone even when they disappoint you. It's about second chances and earned trust and the patience to rebuild what was broken. I hope someday I can be the kind of son who deserves a mother like you. Love, David. P.S. I got a job at a non-profit that helps families navigate financial crisis. The pay is terrible, but the work feels meaningful in a way my old job never did. Rebecca says I'm good at it because I understand what it feels like to lose everything. Who knew that falling apart could actually prepare you for something better? I read the letter 3 times, sitting at my kitchen table with tears streaming down my face. But these weren't tears of sadness or frustration. They were tears of recognition, of seeing glimpses of the boy I'd raised in the man he was becoming. The next week, I called the number he'd included at the bottom of the letter. When he answered, his voice was different, humbler, more genuine than it had been in years. "Mom?" he said, and I could hear both hope and fear in that single word. "I was wondering," I said, "if you and Patricia and Gabriel would like to come for dinner Sunday. Nothing fancy, just a simple meal and a chance to start over." The silence stretched for so long I thought maybe the call had dropped. Then I heard him crying, not the desperate sobs of a man trying to manipulate sympathy, but the quiet tears of someone who'd been given something precious he wasn't sure he deserved. "We would love that," he whispered. "Mom, we would love that so much." That Sunday, they came to my small apartment carrying nothing but themselves and my grandson. No expensive gifts or elaborate apologies, just the simple presence that I'd been craving for so long. Gabriel was walking now, a sturdy 10-month-old with David's dark eyes and my stubborn chin. When I held him for the first time, he studied my face with serious concentration, then smiled and reached for my earrings. Patricia was different too, quieter, less certain of herself, but somehow more real. She apologized without making excuses, acknowledged the pain she'd helped cause without expecting immediate forgiveness. She asked questions about my work, my students, my life, as if she genuinely wanted to know who I was beyond my relationship to David. "I was threatened by you," she admitted, as we cleaned dishes together while David played with Gabriel on the living room floor. "Not because of anything you did, but because David talked about you with such love and respect. I was afraid I could never live up to that, so I convinced myself that the problem was your presence rather than my own insecurity. Insecurity makes us do terrible things sometimes," I said, handing her a dish to dry. "But wisdom comes from learning to recognize it and make different choices." As they were leaving, David hugged me, really hugged me, not the perfunctory embrace of obligation, but the desperate hold of someone who'd almost lost something irreplaceable. "I know it will take time," he said quietly. "I know trust has to be rebuilt, not just given. But if you're willing to try, I want to learn how to be your son again. Not the perfect one you sacrificed everything for, but the real one who makes mistakes and learns from them and shows up anyway." I looked at this man, this father, this flawed human being who'd broken my heart and was now asking for the chance to help heal it. And I felt something I'd thought was lost forever: hope for our future together. "Family isn't about perfection," I told him, repeating words Father Miguel had shared with me during my darkest days. "It's about forgiveness and growth, and choosing to love someone even after they've shown you their worst. It's about second chances and the courage to be vulnerable enough to ask for them." Today, 3 years after that terrible night on the porch, Gabriel calls me abuela and runs to me with sticky hands and boundless joy every Sunday when they come for dinner. David and Patricia both volunteer at the shelter where I once stayed, helping other families navigate crisis with dignity and tact. My son has learned to value what he has instead of constantly reaching for more. And Patricia has discovered that security comes from character rather than circumstances. I still teach my evening classes, still manage the laundromat, still speak to groups of women who need to hear that their worth isn't determined by other people's recognition of it. I've learned that the most powerful transformations happen not when we're rescued from our difficulties, but when we're forced to discover our own strength in the middle of them. Sometimes people ask me if I regret those months of homelessness, those dark nights when I thought my life was over. And I tell them the truth. I regret the pain, but not the lessons. I regret the separation from my family, but not the discovery of my own value. I regret the cruelty, but not the wisdom it eventually brought. The woman who stood on that porch 18 months ago, broken and desperate and invisible, was real. But she wasn't the whole truth of who I was. She was just the woman I'd become when I forgot that love should expand us, not diminish us. I learned that sometimes the most devastating rejections are actually invitations to become the person we were always meant to be. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone we love is the space to discover their own strength, even when watching them struggle breaks our hearts. My name is Isabel Rodriguez, and I am enough. I have always been enough, and that truth belongs to me now, unshakable and eternal, no matter who chooses to see it or not.